evening, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Vuyo Fuchane. I am the Deputy Director at Workers' World Media Productions, and I'm honored to be moderating this discussion tonight on the draft paper on human settlements. I hope you're all doing well and ready to have a meaningful conversation. So tonight we will discuss the draft human settlements white paper, which has been published also for public comment and is a review of the 1994 housing white paper. So while the paper acknowledges the achievements that have been made since 1994, it also highlights some of the significant work that remains. So this discussion is quite a valuable opportunity for us to understand some of the nuances of the white paper and also Paul's review of the white paper, which I hope some of you have also had a look at, and its implications. And I think it's particularly important for the commentary and the discussions we'll be having today, particularly at this, current political juncture that we find ourselves in as a country. So to begin with, I'm just going to go through some few basic house rules and then introduce the panelists for tonight. So if you'd all please mute your microphones throughout the presentations and also your cameras just, to manage bandwidth and connectivity for others as well. And throughout the presentations and the discussions, you can pop your comments in the chat box and Mike and I will be making a note. Mike is on standby for tech support. And so at the end of the presentations that the panelists are going to be giving us, we will then open up for discussions. We should take about no longer than 90 minutes, so maybe about an hour, 30 minutes. But yeah, hopefully we'll have quite a robust discussion. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists who will be discussing some of the political, economic, legal, and community social implications of the white paper. I'll start with Paul Hendler, our lead reviewer for the session. Paul has studied the political economy of housing and urban development and has provided various consulting services in various spheres of government through his company Insight. He posts on Stellenbosch Transparency about elite manipulation of local politics and the grassroots struggle against this, with case studies from Stellenbosch. He is a member of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign Cape Town since 2016. Through the Medium platform, he has published extensively about ideological struggle, providing insights into human discourses, and also on being Jewish, anti-Semitism, and anti-Zionism. Then we have Nomzamo Zondo, who is an attorney and the executive director of the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa, SERI. She works mainly on housing rights cases, defending communities threatened with eviction and litigation, and for the provision of basic services and the upgrading of informal settlements. She has represented many social movements and community-based organizations in their fight for access to land and dignified housing. She also represents informal traders and informal workers who are involved in ongoing battles over their use of public and private land. She is a staunch and spirited advocate for the redistribution of urban land and the recognition of the social value of land to the poor. Then we have Kashifa Ahmad. She is a community activist from the Housing Assembly and is currently the chairperson there. She has been an activist within the trade union space for over 20 years, having served within the COW in the gender structure and within COSATU as well. She is an activist who tirelessly works at challenging various injustices within our local communities. And finally, but certainly not least, we have Patrick Bond, who is a distinguished professor and director of the UJ Center for Social Change and an author of several books on housing services and uneven urban development. He studies geography under David Harvey and moved to South Africa to work at Planet in 1990. So without further ado, Paul, please go ahead and just provide us a brief review and presentation on the draft settlements white paper.
Thank you, Vua. Just before I do that, I wonder whether Patrick couldn't just make a very brief comment about the sort of political purpose of this event as we discussed in preparation.
Well, yeah, let me just warmly greet all of you. I'm sure you're more aware than the average person about the ideological contestation of the next government, the seventh administration, because it might be that we get a human settlements minister who comes from the Democratic Alliance. It might be that the traditions in which some of the urban populism that we have witnessed in, even the very first minister, Joe Slovo from the Communist Party, going through Lindy Sisulu and and onwards, the sense that housing would be something that would be a gift, one of these small RDP houses, instead of a major public housing program. That neoliberal populism, may I call it that, is an ideological orientation right from the 1994, the white paper, has, I would argue, not worked, and we'll get into one or two of the areas where I think there's some crises a little later, like housing finance and the indebtedness of ordinary poor and working people. But the most important question is whether the social movements can mobilize, and whether the housing, the human settlements draft white paper, and something they just ignore because they're too busy on the streets doing service delivery protests, demanding housing, invading land, which we saw certainly in mid-2020 at a record rate as the landlords tossed out people who couldn't pay during the COVID crisis. This is, I think, ultimately where we'd all love to hear from each of you, from the sites of struggle you're all in, to say, well, what's the pulse on the ground? And being a petit bourgeois academic, in a university like UJ, I don't have my finger on that pulse. So I'm really looking forward to learning from all of you, dear comrades. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Patrick, for those opening remarks. I think they're quite key in sort of orientating the moment that we find ourselves in. Paul, would you please go ahead?
Thank you. Yes. Changing the world starts with understanding it. And in this review of the Human Settlements White Paper, I unpacked the ideology that rationalizes home ownership and suggests a framework for exploring home ownership's limits and possibilities in society. And this has implications for civic engagement with or disengagement from the politics of state power. The overview of what I wrote in quite a bit of detail on the Insight website and more sort of synopsis like on the Medium platform, is that most inputs to the draft white paper tend to be positivist. That is, they accept the stated goals of the policy at face value. They reflect on the theory of change, and they give short shrift to a detailed empirical analysis as integral to assessing the document. So the starting point of my critique is that the white paper creates and reproduces subjects as entrepreneurs, as the authentic identity of South African citizens. Like its 1994 predecessor, this white paper casts the identity of citizens as isolated households subjectively seized to accumulate wealth through buying and selling assets. While the document itself nowhere explicitly articulates this, nevertheless, and this is the underlying conceptual element that unifies what appears to be a plurality of disconnected terms: finance, the market, the economy, climate, empowerment, capacity, governance, population, and housing typologies. So both the 94 and the current draft white paper assume that the ubiquitous trading by individuals of housing assets will drive us to become a prosperous society. Could you bring in the first slide, Patrick? I mean, not Patrick, Mike. Sorry. So drawing on the work of Louis Althusser, I define civic identity as ideology, in this case, the ideology of neoliberalism, which functions as, to quote him, unified, despite its diversity and its contradictions, beneath the ruling ideology, which is the ideology of the ruling class. He made the point that under capitalism, subject identities are interpolated by what he called ideological state apparatuses, or ISAs. That is, specific apparatuses of the capitalist state function to call out individual subjects with specific identities. So, for example, the legal ISAs, like the courts and justice departments, interpolate subjects as rights-bearing and rights-responsible citizens. The national, provincial, and local departments of human settlements functioned as ISAs to interpolate subjects as homeowner entrepreneurs. So first, my analysis demonstrates examples in the text that refer to or at least imply these homeowner entrepreneur terms. Second, I attempt to assess the likelihood of the human settlements ISAs achieving their stated long-term objective of a prosperous, non-racial, and integrated home ownership society. By way of introduction, I briefly refer to the 94 White Paper's provision of a free but modest RDP unit intended to kickstart the home ownership to wealth process, linked to de-risking measures for private mortgage credit, seen as the primary means of funding home ownership for the black working classes. I quote from specific texts in the draft white paper to demonstrate that government views direct property ownership as a key factor facilitating not just household wealth, but also addressing unemployment. Although the draft white paper does not say so, I know from consulting work for the National Treasury about the strategy to target public investment for affordable rented social housing and public transport. Excuse me. In densified urban zones to bring work and living places close. My voice is really letting me down tonight. Close to one another, as well as create ethnically integrated towns and cities. Thus, home ownership twinned with spatial targeting is the strategic frame for realizing the entrepreneur civic identity practically. Now, parallel to and dependent on generating household wealth through home ownership secondary markets, the government's social housing policy intends to integrate segregated towns and cities, as well as to reinforce the proximity of work and living places through developments in restructuring zones. Designed initially as encompassing a diversity of tenure, like sectional title ownership, cooperative ownership, rent to buy, and conventional rental. Conventional rental has predominated as social housing tenure by its occupants. However, lest this be seen as a concession to alternative tenures to home ownership, it should be noted that rental is rationalized as part of a quote unquote housing ladder where entrepreneur households climb and are incentivized to climb to the ultimate goal of home ownership. Could you bring in the second slide, please, Mike? So noticeably absent from the draft white paper are empirical indicators assessing the extent to which the mutually reinforcing goals of home ownership, wealth, and urban integration have been realized. If we compare Stats SA's household income figures between Census 2011 and Census 2022, we see that whereas 27% of households, which is the top two sort of parts of that bar chart, could afford mortgage finance in 2011, 43% could do so in 2022. If you could bring the third slide in, Mike. So that 43% is, if you add up from the 29% upwards. Although if we go back to that earlier bar, if you were to include the 3,501 and 7,500 household income category from the 2011 figures, you would see there's no change in the percentage of households theoretically able to afford mortgage finance. In other words, 42 or 43% theoretically able to do that, and therefore theoretically as candidates for this strategy. However, much more important than what's theoretically possible on paper is the actual churn of housing sales in these sub-markets. And if you could just show slide 4, please, Mike. So official figures on this table, I'm excluding the entry segment at the top because it's got virtually no mortgage finance in it, and a lot of those houses are selling for below the RDP value, which contradicts this whole strategy. But official figures demonstrate an actual churn of about 1.94 million units between 2008 and 2019 in the market segments affordable for this 43% of households. That's the affordable segment, about 575,000 units, the conventional segment, which is 600 to 900,000 as a price, about 460,000 units, the so-called high-end segment, that's about 900 to 1.2 million, 225,000 units, and then the luxury starting at 1.2 million, almost 677,000 units. Interesting that that is the largest amount, but not surprising. Insofar as integrated towns and cities are concerned, by 2024, some 299 restructuring zones spread across the 8 metropolitan municipalities, as well as a further 42 local municipalities, have been formally gazetted. However, we need to measure these achievements or outputs by the extent of actual residential, commercial, and ethnic integration in these zones, as well as the economic outcomes, especially, but not solely, in respect of enterprise creation, reducing unemployment, and employee income. The economic development and urban integration impact of the housing human settlements policies over 30 years appears very uneven, with a tendency towards being very limited. Post-1994 South Africa has experienced jobless growth. The critical questions are whether asset accumulation, household wealth, has, where it has occurred, okay? In other words, in this churn that you see here, which is probably less than that 43% of households who've actually participated in the market. So the question is, where it has occurred, can this asset accumulation, household wealth, be sustained by the broader political economy? And secondly, whether this economy can enable the excluded 57% majority of households to participate as housing entrepreneurs. There has been and still is a large proportion of economically active population either unemployed or at best in seasonal employment, exacerbated by the recent lockdown shock to the employment of semi-skilled and unskilled workers. Integration of residential and workspaces, including ethnic integration, appears anecdotally, because I'm unaware of proper research on this, to be very limited. And this is likely because social housing, a key instrument of spatial targeting, represents only 1% of the entire rental market. So in conclusion, the neoliberal identity formation of prosperous household entrepreneurs faces limits imposed by high levels of unemployment, relatively low wages. These prevent the majority of households from affording entry into the affordable housing market and even into the primary target market for social housing tenants, which is households earning between 1,008 and 5,500 monthly. And the key factor is the unaffordability to municipalities of the price of favorably located land and integrated transport. And so the Achilles heel of the 94 white paper, the 2004 comprehensive housing plan, and now again with the draft white paper is that the delivery of affordable and social housing is burdened with an impossible task because developments in the single sector are unable to achieve what requires a compendium of interventions from other sectors, the financial sector, the economic development sector, spatial planning, health, social welfare, etc. The case of Singapore demonstrates that the state as a public developer, an identity which goes beyond that of being a public entrepreneur and regulator of private entrepreneurs, needs to play a lead role in organizing and managing this compendium of interventions, as well as directly participating in relevant interventions. This is to maximize outcomes that start approximating the household prosperity, economic development, work opportunities, and spatial ethnic integration objectives. However, state intervention development is anathema to neoliberal ideology, with its emphasis on the self-sufficiency of individual citizens and on an entrepreneurial-driven state. Thus, in practice, the human settlement policy assumptions are more often than not undermined by the unintended consequences arising from the implementation. The impact is exclusion and marginalization of the majority of households, which becomes the basis for social conflict that has been punctuated by peak moments of uprising during the entire short history of the post-apartheid state. This is likely to continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Those were some really, really, really great insights. Particularly, I think, the visual of the data and just showing the kind of discrepancy between the effectiveness of the strategies that have been outlined in the white paper, the age-old policy versus practice dichotomy that, a lot of white papers and policies in our countries often struggle with. So I think, not to overanalyze your presentation, I'll hand over to Unomzamo to give us her thoughts and her inputs.
Thank you so much, Vuyo, and thank you to Paul. I think it gives a great grounding for my own input, which is really grounded on a submission that was made on the draft white paper by Seri together with Abahlali Basemjondolo and the Inner City Federation, whose real concern was, is this white paper going to bring a decisive direction towards the inclusion of the majority that Paul spoke about? And I think in reading the white paper from the very beginning, there are a lot of positive aspects that give you hope. Already, you can see that there's a focus on addressing security of tenure for the majority of people who live outside the ownership market and who are not normally visible to the private property system. It speaks a little bit about brownfielding as opposed to greenfield developments. It also speaks, as it should, on the impact of unemployment and poverty in our country, as Paul pointed out. And so I think in reviewing it, there was a lot of hope about what it would mean. But unfortunately, all of these three organizations are also kind of grounded in the reality of this current moment, how this government has responded to that majority that lives outside the private ownership model, and had to kind of look at, are there any causes for concern? And I think primarily already from the get-go, there were things in there. I laughed because Paul referred to how the courts and the judicial system will go to where they first go. And already for me as a lawyer, I was initially concerned about how the white paper articulated the relationship of the department with the constitution, and the department basically coming out and saying, we have a challenge. We are asking ourselves, how far must we go in implementing Section 26 of the Constitution? And you wonder, but how is it a question? Are we not a country of constitutional supremacy where actually you are bound? In fact, your authority comes from that constitution, and therefore there can't be a competition between your administrative duty to deliver human settlement and your obligation to deliver that very same right to adequate housing. And unfortunately, that thread around almost a disavowal of the Constitution continues both from where the starting point of the white paper, which focuses only on Section 26, which is the right to housing, even though one of the key messaging around the white paper is the expansion away from housing to human settlements. But then even within Section 26, you can see that there is a focus on, yes, we have to deliver adequate housing, and they give an expansive definition. They give us the assurance that actually there is a concern for poor individuals, for people who are living in unsafe conditions. They even go as far as saying to us there will be opportunities for us to use inner cities as a place where we can address spatial apartheid. But then at the very same time, when it comes to the rights of protecting people against arbitrary eviction, there's a very different messaging. But even more than that, one of our primary concerns, in fact, that we addressed in the submission was, but you've ignored the obligation put on the state by Section 25 of the Constitution, which is to make sure that there is equitable access to land by people who were previously disadvantaged. In the very same way, even though you speak boldly about security of tenure, you've ignored that very same obligation in Section 25(6) of the Constitution, which again calls government to make sure that people who had insecure tenure have that addressed. And then in the midst of that, while we are looking at that, we start to look at what is actually their position on evictions. What is their position on making sure that progressive realization isn't just simply by saying we've built 2 million houses over this time, we've built 3 million houses. What are they saying about the lives of people? Are people actually in better living conditions now than they were some time ago? And unfortunately, the red flags come out very strongly. One, there's a clear line that we should expect an iron fist in a velvet glove. That in effect, the state's position, even in this white paper, is to say, in relation to unlawful occupation, one, the National Department will provide support to stop the proliferation of informal settlements. Two, there's a point that we will deal decisively with unlawful occupation. And then the most difficult thing for Abahlali baseMjondolo and the Inner City Federation to accept, which is that actually our plan is to take away the very protection that you've had against eviction. So that actually the fact that you are now secure, yes, you are in an informal settlement, yes, you don't have access to basic services, but at least you are assured that before you are removed, there are procedural protections. Before you are removed, there would be a process where you can protect yourself, where you can protect your family. And then specifically something that the white paper specifically mentions, that if you are going to be displaced, that there's an alternative accommodation provided to you. And the white paper says, not here. That's not going to happen here, which for us is a worrying sign. But then there were things that felt timely and important in this moment, which was about, for instance, there's a promise to ensure the empowerment of women, of women, to make sure that they access land. But then you look through the white paper, and I promise you will not be able to find the data on what what are the levels of ownership. What is in terms of data, racially, in terms of class, in terms of gender? How does ownership look like in South Africa? And it's not that they are meant to go and start from scratch and build that data. Another government department had produced it in 2017 and gives a comprehensive picture. And maybe we can forget the data. But secondly, there could have been at least an approach to introduce an intersectional lens that would look at how ownership looks like in relation to race, to gender, to class. And even looking at the issue of youth. And again, any literature around intersectionality is missing in the white paper. What we have is a promise to have an empowerment and transformation plan in place. But the question is, what will inform that empowerment and transformation plan? If this white paper is going to be adopted as is, what do we have as a guarantee that we're not going to have the very same promises being made to us without any real change? And a key input from the submission was, again, unfortunately, even though there is an admission that we are facing unrelenting poverty, even though there is an acceptance that our history has contributed to the fact that there's landlessness in this country, but there is also at the very same time a criminalization of the social production of shelter. There's a clear message which I referred to earlier as almost bringing a response of the iron fist in a velvet glove, because they are saying, if you are unlawfully occupying land, we will deal with you, which means that they're not accepting the consequences of our apartheid past. They're not accepting the consequences of their failure in the last 30 years to ensure that there is equitable access to land. And even though we have a white paper that's meant to be a new broom and a new story, unfortunately, the majority of people who are not in ownership are not able to see from the plans that are put in place how change will happen. And one of the things that happened, Vuyo, is that when the consultations happened at the end of last year, the consultation process was intentionally short. It was short in a way that, again, it excluded the majority from coming in and saying, well, these are our views on these points. And even though, yes, acknowledged, there were 2 extensions provided after the end of January, but it crippled the ability of organized civil society, of organized movements to have a voice in this white paper, and therefore at least give an opportunity which at least was there in relation to the 1994 white paper, where people could say, actually, this is not how we want to go. We actually want a white paper that's going to focus on the majority. We want interventions that are going to improve our lives. And we want interventions where we can hold you accountable. And there are many things, Vuyo, that, again, because I want to end on a positive note, that they acknowledge. They acknowledge the failures of service delivery. They acknowledge the failures of cooperative governance. But unfortunately, none of the plans, if you go through the documents, none of the plan comes forward with solutions that will help the majority of South Africans, and definitely none of their plans will help the members of the Inner City Federation or Abahlali baseMjondolo who live in unsatisfied conditions right now. I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nomzamo, for those inputs. I think for me, your points around the lack of intersectionality and the lack of deliberateness of ensuring that, race, class, gender, age, even history are things that are taken into serious consideration are some of the really glaring challenges. And also, I appreciate how, you brought into this conversation some of the legal aspects around this white paper, some of the constitutional mandates, and some of the shortcomings. And I'd like to read one comment that came in from Yolande, that she agrees regarding the social production of shelter and the importance of alternatives, that is the mode of production, and what is the reality for the majority of South Africans. And I think both you and Paul touched on the issue of the inclusion of the majority and how some of the policies that are being propagated in both the 1994 draft and this one are clearly lacking in how that will actually actualize. So without giving my own presentation, I will ask Kashifa to please come in and give us what are some of her thoughts and what are some of the things that the Housing Assembly thinks around this white paper. Kashifa?
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, but I think, the previous speakers have covered so much of the things that we have discussed within the communities and the groups that we have discussions on this white paper. And, on this white paper, there's quite a few things that was not covered and we weren't sure because they don't speak to the things that affects us. When we look at the affordable rental housing, so it's just a limited of affordable homes and rentals that are developed within the state when you compare to the market homes and rentals. So when you look at rental accommodations in the well-located areas, it's still inaccessible for many poor and low-income families. many rely on backyarders and, you know, the small scale developers that to access more affordable housing. And I think that is the way that our government wants to move with these small scale housing developers. Despite the importance of backyarders and small scale developments in meeting housing needs of the poor. So also it seems like that is the way they are operating now. So the concerns that we had on this rental units, you know, when it comes to the rental accommodation, you know, like I said, it's the well-located area is still inaccessible, and, you know, the poor is not able to afford it. But also we've seen with these, in these well-located areas also, these units are also up for sale, up for auction and all these things. But yet we have a backlog of housing within our city. I can say it's a 600,000 people that is on the waiting list. So when you look at this, the inaccessibility in the well-located area is also preventing people from moving into these areas. So it is also not very accessible for people with disabilities, and because of the housing development tends to be in the form of multi-story apartments, and people is not even able to get to the apartments. In addition, when the residents in these developments lose their jobs, they're not able to afford the rentals, and it's immediately vulnerable to evictions. And that is what we've seen within the rental unit. And with even these rental units within our communities, you know, people are staying there for many years. And I can make an example of some of the areas. If you look at Manenberg, there's people that's living there for 40 to 50 years in these council units. And until today, they still don't have even the title deed of those homes. So it's also people that's been placed forcefully there through the apartheid system, and yet nobody was compensated with that. So when you look at the quality of the infrastructure within community rental units, it's very poor. Also, it's not even being maintained. And those are the challenges that community have. But yet they are paying these rent within these households. You know, I always make an example when we talk about people that's paying years this rent. When you buy a house by the bank, you will pay 25 to 30 years and you finish. But when it comes to council housing, you will pay forever, whether it's 40 to 50 years, you will continue doing these things. So these are the challenges and concerns that we've raised in the white paper. So the white paper is very unclear on what kind of assistance government will provide to traditional backyard dwellers, because what we've seen with backyard dwellers is, you know, the service are given to backyard dwellers, but is that a permanent residence, or how is it going to happen? Because we see that people is on the waiting list from 1990. If you go into some of the area, there's still people on the waiting list from 1990. So you are backyarder for how long? Because when you become a backyarder, city is giving you the services within communities, but it becomes then your permanent home, because we can see there's no development really happening within our communities. It's a very slow pace. So like you were also saying, there's no solution for homelessness is mentioned also. And transitional housing is an option. It could be an option also, because in Cape Town currently at this moment, people are being evicted from the street. So that is also playing out, and as a lot of homeless people, that's materials are going to be taken away, and you know it's winter, and this time of the year, it's always happening within our communities. So these are our concerns from communities that is happening. And then I want to speak also about the TRAs, the temporary relocated areas. There's also little mention of the TRAs. You know, you find the Blikkiesdorp where people are occupying there now for almost 15 years. During the World Cup, people were placed there. Until today, those people are there, and it becomes an area infested with gangsterism, high unemployment, the crime rate is so high. So nothing has been done yet with those communities. How are those communities going to be accommodated? You know, one of the things that we've raised also is when it comes to developers in our area, when there's needs to be developing, needs to be done within our area, with the RDP houses, whether it's what, you will find developers are not really interested in doing it in the community because it's very cheap. But when you look at social housing, when it's in the inner city or wherever in the white areas it's happening, you will find developers will bow that. In 6 months, the building is up. But in our communities, those type of things is not happening. You have still houses. Nobody seems to be accountable. That is incomplete. And it's still standing like that. So those are the things that we are grappling with. And I think the white paper needs to be clear on the transparency and accountability, because when you look at the transparency of even of the waiting list, people don't know. When you go to the city, they will tell you, no, you must wait, it's not your turn yet. But yet they are saying you must go on the waiting list, but you can't be on the waiting list since 1990, and nothing is happening. So those are the challenges that we've seen in this document. And then also I want to speak on our communities are affected also by occupations. The one thing that we also raise is, people are staying in these occupations for a very long time, and the land needs to be bought. The land needs to be bought because people can't be uprooted and moved to another piece of land. Houses should be built where people live, and that should happen. And alternative materials also needs to be looked at also, how you're going to do this in communities, because we find that communities are being uprooted and moved to the outskirts of Cape Town. So we don't want people to move further away because there's no amenities, and yet it's okay for our government to say that we need to move people because it's not safe in that. But I think, when we look at spatial planning, the way the city is doing these things, there's so many buildings that is vacant within our community. What we are looking into this paper and also saying is those buildings need to be refurnished, they need to fix those buildings, because you can't have so many people being homeless and yet we have vacant buildings that can be utilized. There's so many pieces of land that is also vacant within our city. Those people also, there needs to be houses that needs to be built. They want to, the thing that they are talking about is social housing. And social housing is on everyone's lips. And social housing is not accommodating everybody. So many people are unemployed. So we are working with comrades who's unemployed. So where do we fit in? How does the social housing accommodate? Yes, people want to move closer to the city because there's opportunities. It's easier to drive to work, to be in the city, because our people are sitting for hours in traffic. So if you stay closer to the city, you will save on those things because people are paying very little money. But being in the inner city, does that mean I'm going to stay there forever? Because what we are seeing people, with social housing, I'm able to afford my social housing today. 6, 7 years down the line, I'm being unemployed or I become a pensioner, I'm not able to afford anymore. And then what we see is people being evicted and there's no other alternative how to accommodate that. And we also find even the elderly is on the road because of them not being able to pay for the social housing. So we have a huge problem when it comes to affordable, because we are saying, what is affordable for an unemployed person? I want to pause for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kashifa. I think, you being based in Cape Town, and I think most of us will be familiar with some of the housing struggles in Cape Town. I think Cape Town is, the epitome of inequality in South Africa in various ways. And I think the housing crisis there is exemplary of that. And I think for me, your inputs really brought home some of the connections between spatial apartheid planning and the ramifications that we are seeing. And I think for me, it's kind of a reproduction in a way of those those kinds of approaches to housing, to homelessness and such. And I think really some of your parting remarks around the connections between the precarity of employment and the insecurity around shelter and housing are intricately intertwined. And some of the proposals, such as social housing, are inadequate to address both of those things. So thank you so much for your inputs. I will hand over to Patrick Bond to give us his presentation.
Very quick things, 1.5 minutes each, just to add to this very, very heavy critique that we've been hearing, would be, first of all, some of those, let's say, intermediate steps to where we are now. And I think the Housing White Paper of 1994 set the sort of tone and the ether of neoliberalism that Paul introduced very well. The Grootboom decision in 2000 was initially seen as a success because the Constitutional Court said that Joe Slovo's housing policy didn't deal with the very poor. And indeed, Eileen Grootboom died homeless because in the division of labor between the courts and the executive, the Constitutional Court didn't feel it could do anything to change policy to make that happen. And I think it's because there was two major financial problems. So second, after dealing with Grootboom as a failure, not a success, as a sort of legal strategy, I'm hoping Nomzana will correct me if I've got that wrong. The second is the inadequate finance, the subsidization, which in the original Housing White Paper, because we put it into the original Reconstruction and Development Program, 5% of the housing of the national budget should have been dedicated to the subsidization so that we wouldn't have the problems of inadequate and then top-up finance, inadequate amounts of money to do much more than site and service and the 28 square meter typical RDP house. And of course, that's shrunk even further now with the new stress on site and service, like the old apartheid era. The subsidization has been in the range of 1.1 to 1.4%. And that brings us to the extreme inequality in the built environment. And that you see in that graphic where there's just such an exceptional, like Johannesburg, #1 city in the world for inequality, according to what's called the Palm ratio, Cape Town #5. And that brings us to the next slide, which is the resulting failure to take the surpluses from those extremely high prices and to redistribute them. And you can see as a result in this next slide that the location of houses is absolutely, let's say, amplifying apartheid because the location of those little blue dots, the RDP houses, corresponds to a re-racialization that's also on class grounds. We go to the next slide. You'll see the second big part of my argument, which is that we've had an excessive reliance upon debt. And that didn't work for the missing middle because, as the Human Settlement White Paper shows, there is really a mortgage lending gap for especially between the 3,500 Rand per month and the extent, say, to which you could build your decent little house with a bond. And the reason for that is partly the incredibly high interest rates we've been suffering. Really, since 1995, we had an increase in a real interest rate of about 4% because of the deregulation of our exchange controls. Some of you with gray hair might remember something called the FinRand, the financial rand. When that was taken away in early 1995, in the midst of the emerging markets meltdown, then we saw interest rates by then Chris Stals, the Reserve Bank governor, shoot up. And that ratcheting up has never been brought back down to the point where you can borrow, except for the period in 2020-21 during COVID when artificially the interest rate was put way down because of the crisis. So if you were borrowing, you would see this sort of process. And in the House, I know we have Anne-Marie Makushlu, who does the work on this household indebtedness and housing in Khayelitsha. But I think I'll move to the very final point, which is to get to the way, not just housing credit in a formal sense, but we go to the next graphic, you'll see the informal sector's housing finance, which is in the form of the debit orders that get put onto the grants. And since some 27 million South Africans are on these monthly grants, this becomes very crucial, especially with the people you see at the top of that graphic. And those people on the left are Hilda Incantini, who is a sort of guinea pig. It really, I think, very much in the spirit that the man on the right, AJ Banga, the then head of MasterCard, trying to give Hilda a credit card, well, a debit card, so that she wouldn't have to stand in the long queues and be subject to tsotsis when she got her monthly grant, and those of her children as well, as you see in the right. Now, it's a very interesting story because this man, AJ Banga, a year ago exactly became the president of the World Bank on grounds that he'd done such a great job with financial inclusion and the algorithms that would allow him and the man down on the bottom left, and made a cartoon character, Serge Bellamont. And what they ended up doing with Cash Paymaster Services, which was 22% owned by the World Bank, was putting massive debit orders, even 6-year-old girls getting microfinance and burial society and cell phone contracts and all the rest. Now, all of that fell apart by 2017 and 18. And my stories of resistance often start with Sanko and the bond boycotts, all that wonderful stuff I put into the books that I put into the chat for you to remember if you have fond memories of kind of collective action against housing finance. The more recent version of that was with Black Sash, because they took not only to court, but in the streets, the street heat protests. They didn't mobilize collective default, which is a strategy after the 2008 financial crisis. It was discussed all around the world, and I have a piece that's coming out in critical housing analysis next week. I'll put that on the chat after I finish. That goes through the extent to which South Africans in the early 1990s with the bond boycotts taught the world about the collective default strategy. Now, it had been done before, but then in Mexico with El Barzon, and then in 2008 with consumer debt movements, especially student movements in the US after the great financial crisis. Now, what all of this represents to me is a chance to really talk about the ways social movement advocacy can take this problem of human settlements white paper that's so grounded in the market.
Around our inequality and the political economy analysis of that. And he actually made quite a striking point around how, you know, apartheid has in a way sort of been amplified, which I thought was quite interesting. And some of the issues around, you know, reliance on debt, reliance on social grants and social protection to make provisions for everything, and the kind of over-indebtedness of low-income households. So with that being said, I would like to open up to the floor for some comments, questions, anything that's, you know, popped to mind as we've been having this discussion this evening. Anyone? And Kashifa, was that a hand? Oh, Yolande, yes. Please unmute and go ahead. Floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'm a little bit reticent perhaps to start in the open debate because I will probably contribute a bit more of a global view than a local view, but I'll just briefly introduce myself. My name is Yolande Hendler, and I'm here actually sort of in a personal capacity as well as partly professional. Personal as a South African who was previously working with the Community Organization Resource Center, supporting a lot of informal settlement organizing around upgrading initiatives. And so I think being very, very rooted in the grassroots struggles quite realistically. So I really appreciated your contribution, Kashifa. And then secondly, professionally, because now I'm actually working for the Habitat International Coalition, which is a global coalition of civil society organizations and social movements working on housing and land rights and grappling with a lot of these issues. So it's really nice to see a lot of you colleagues who we know, and Nomzamo as well as the Socioeconomic Rights Institute is a member also of HIC. So I guess just some reflections. I think the overall sort of analysis that kind of the underlying challenge that we are facing here is really how we conceive of housing. And a lot of what we speak of in HIC, and that part of the problem globally, is that housing is treated as a commodity and not as a human right. And I think very simply put, that is what I understood as the basis and the starting point of our conversation. And what does that mean? It means that we have corporations as well as governments prioritizing the exchange value over the use value of housing. And a lot of the language that we use in HIC is that actually housing and land need to be recognized in terms of their social function and their ecological function. What does housing, what does a home mean to people socially, but also to recognize ourselves as linked very much to the environment. And I know these are approaches also, for example, that Abahlali Basem Jondolo really follows quite a lot. So I just wanted to share a little bit sort of globally what the context is, that the challenges that we're talking about here, that I was hearing, are very much reflected in the global discourse as well. This challenge of housing as a commodity is pretty much present in all the countries that HIC member organizations work in. And that there's actually been a global movement, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, called The Shift, and that the former special rapporteur on the right to housing to the United Nations actually globally raised this as a major problem, that the and I think really brought to the global attention the problem of the financialization of housing. And so that is one reflection. The other is that housing as an agenda globally is falling off the map. So currently the United Nations is sort of revising its global multilateral plan, and housing and habitat doesn't feature in it at all. Why is that? It's because we actually see a growing corporatization and a corporate capture really of states as well as multilateral institutions. That means that states actually cannot afford to, or aren't using the revenue that they have to actually cover their social responsibilities. And so, yeah, I think I just wanted to share that sort of globally, I think the challenges are very mirrored. And I'm just wondering, so in this context, what are the opportunities? What are the concrete opportunities? And this was, I think, something that Nomzamo was saying as well. How do we end on or how do we begin maybe on a constructive note, knowing that the challenges we're facing here are huge? The battle is, on the one hand, ideological in the sense that we need to understand what the structural issues are that we are fighting against. But on the other hand, it's really, really practical because it's, you know, people's bread and butter in a very real sense. And so some of what social movements and organizations that are part of HIC are talking about, is how we advance this idea of the social production of habitat, and Nomzamo touched on that. So to say, what is the alternative of the market logic is to actually support people-led processes. We've had examples of that already in this country, partly in the people's housing process, which may not have been perfect, but there have been examples of the state supporting that. And there have also been examples, I think, of the upgrading informal settlements grant. I understand that now sort of support for that and actually financing for that has been greatly diminished. But to perhaps start developing a language of why social production of habitat is valuable and actually how it contributes. And also that the reality is that the majority of people in any population are actually constructing and producing their own solutions to housing needs to be recognized. And I think the primary challenge here is, on the one hand, getting legal support and recognition for these community-led, self-managed, built solutions to housing. This can also include, for example, co-ops and various forms of social management. And then secondly, to actually get budget support for this kind of work. And there are examples, and here I would perhaps encourage us to think more broadly than the sort of stereotypical examples of the East Asian tigers, but to look at countries in Latin America, which I think have maybe much more similar conditions. So there is, for example, a housing law in Argentina that was passed in 2000 called the Self-Managed Housing Act that has precisely actually supported these kind of processes. Similar examples in Brazil, where social movements have achieved quite some recognition. Mexico, as well as Jakarta in Indonesia. So I'm happy to share links on that. And then I think just lastly, the South African Human Settlements Department globally is also leading an initiative on, it's called the Global Action Plan on accelerating the upgrading of informal settlements. And is putting this forward in a massive way globally. I don't know how many local organizations are engaging with this or even aware of it, but the image that the department is putting forward globally is quite different, I think, to what is happening within the country. And then lastly, I'm aware also that civil society organizations like DAG and Isandla are putting forward a model of housing support centers, which is a space sort of trying and testing what a housing support center to assist self-build could look like. So to experiment a bit with a practical example of what social production of habitat looks like. So I just wanted to, those are just some reflections that came to mind, and very happy now to return back to the very more local context here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. Those were quite informative and really powerful reflections, particularly your opening ones around the commodification of housing and just of generally of socioeconomic rights, I think. I think Nomzamo would also agree that there has been a trend towards that with the increase of neoliberal policies. So I'd like to also encourage anybody else who has any reflections, either from what Yolande has also just shared or based on the presentations that we've heard.
Can I just say something also?
Sure, yes.
On what Yolanda was saying. When it comes to informal settlement, I think there should be consultation also with communities. And I think those are the things that not really happening. Because I hear she's speaking about this thing with the government and DAG, they're engaging on this thing as something different that they bring to the table. But I think communities should also be informed what is on the table, what type of things is on the table. Because when you look at informal settlement, you need to look at alternative materials that needs to be used. Are they going to use alternative materials? Because winter it's flooding, summer it's fire. So it's every year the same thing with informal settlement. Nothing has really changed for the last 30 years. So you ask yourself, so what is on the table that communities are not involved with? Because I think if you bring something to communities, communities want to be involved. And when you talk to them, you need the buy-in of communities also, because most of the time things are being enforced on communities because, you are so vulnerable and you are so grateful that the things are coming to you. So you just have to accept what is coming your way. But there's no thing like, okay, there's different alternatives that we can use that is good for the environment, or you know what I'm talking about, some things like that. But it's always on the last of the discussion that the government is bringing to communities, okay, this is what we want to do. And I think that way of operating, they need to stop that operating. Because, when we have buy-ins of communities, you won't have that infights also, because communities, there's a division sometimes within communities when things are coming to our areas. And the other thing also, what I want to say is also, so many of our communities are also in debt. They are not even able to do anything because, when you look at them, and even some of those who's working also, those things are even not considered when you look at, I'm just thinking about this affordable housing, because so many people are in debt, and that is just the reality. Even the ones that is you getting the SASSA grant, because you're living from the hand to the mouth. So there's no way that people can able to afford this thing of affordable, because even when the social housing is there, and the minimum is 1.8. Now, if you look at 1.8, your rent is 600. Where's electricity? Where's the water? Where's the food? So you need to add all those things out, because those things are not in consideration. It's not been taken into any consideration, because that is just the reality of what is currently happening within our community. I just want to pause for now. Sorry.
No, don't apologize. Thank you so much, Kesipa. Geeta, I see your hand. Please unmute. I'll just quickly read a comment from Yolande that meaningful community participation, which can actually influence and change decision-making, is so important. So I think she's just emphasizing your points, and that this is exactly what social production of habitat is about, that is controlled by communities, and that governments support people's initiatives and community-led initiatives. So Geeta, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to just reflect on where we're heading. I'm going to tell you a very brief story. I became involved with the community of Kosovo in Philippi in 2007, and I have been involved with that community until the present day, and very little has changed. Now, the people who live in that community have moved up to 7 times from different settlements to finally find their place in this place. And the challenge at hand, we've been part of a so-called catalytic project, which was started 7 years ago, again, to find a way of upgrading this informal settlement by de-densifying and finding alternative land and locating them. I'm going to give you some stats while I describe this, because this whole arena of human settlements has been immensely frustrating. In the meantime, as a practitioner in urban design and planning and human settlements, we have become involved in the delivery of housing as contractors. So in Langa, we delivered 10 units on 400 square meters in 2 months, working with the community of shacks that were there. And this was an experiment with the city of Cape Town, This housing is not going to win awards, but I feel very gratified that there are roofs over 10 families who are able to actually move into the future. So it was basically a box with partitions and staircases and timber floors internally that people could immediately move into, and then the services were plugged in from the back. So that's a very interesting solution for me. Then in Sweet Homes, we delivered 450 units over a 5-year period where the city refused to actually increase the budget. This was a so-called prize for an innovative housing solution. And at tremendous personal cost, we delivered this housing using innovative materials, where we took an existing town planning layout and we pulled the units together to share party walls on the quadrant, on the cross section of the 4 sites. And again, if I look at what we delivered there, using an emergency housing budget, we delivered 32 square meters, just to show that it's possible. And then the city came in and put in the services. And again, that's quite an interesting living example. Not going to win any kind of prizes, looks like shit now, because everyone's actually plugged in their shacks and whatever. But again, it's safe and people are under the roof. And then in Philippi itself, with this Kosovo project, we managed to negotiate a small piece of land where formal housing has been delivered, 350 units in the last 7 years, against a stack up of 10,000 units that we're supposed to be addressing. Now, we've had no movement on the 10,000 units. Now, the narrative has changed over the last 7 years from a window of opportunity where provincial government was sending money back to national fiscus because we were unable to spend that funding on the ground, to now actually a situation where we don't even think that there's enough money available for service sites. In the Philippi context, that community has moved from fire to flood annually with very, very difficult circumstances. And we just did a shack count there on an aerial photograph, and the average footprint of what people occupy is about 35 square meters. Now, there's no more land to relocate them to. There's a tiny bit of land. We think that they would have to be reblocked in some way. And the question I'm asking is, what can a design process that is trying to secure rights for development and secure tenure, and I bow down to all of the participatory and other things that have been shared, but I'm asking, here's an opportunity to shift the lives of 6,500 households that we're addressing right now, because we can't work on other sites because they belong to other institutions, or even 4,000 is actually what it's boiling down to. What can we do with sites that might be no more than 35 to 40 square meters that provides services, fireproofing, a roof over people's head, and a woman doesn't get killed because she's going to the toilet at night and has to walk a long distance to go to a toilet? Those are the basic conditions, and the kind of sharing of toilets is an unspeakable ratio of 40-1 or whatever. And, you know, so the unspeakable conditions still. What are we going to do? I feel like globally, the poor have been sold out. Our system is not serving them. We are stuck as stuck can be. What are we going to do?
Quite a pertinent question, I think. And I think it's really interesting that you've sort of shared some of the alternatives that you've been involved in terms of the provision of housing and structures and shelters. So before I hand over back to my panelists, are there any other reflections from the floor? All right, going once, going twice. So I just think maybe just to, as you reflect, your concluding reflections and remarks to my panelists, maybe you can also just touch a bit on the question that Gita has raised just now, and then, you know, provide us with your roundup. So I will start with you, Paul.
Yes, I've been just listening and noting all the inputs, but I think the Gita's input right at the end is quite a important sort of grounding point. And it also speaks to the desperation on the ground and the lack of an appropriate strategy, never even mind an appropriate strategy, the lack of a willingness, you know, at the various levels of governance, of authorities to deal with this. Part of it is in the context of austerity and not making the budgets available. Part of it is this whole ideology of entrepreneurialism, where people in the governmental authorities are very focused. I haven't spoken about this in my piece, on something called good governance. And if you look at the strong parts content of the draft housing white paper, you'll see a good example of that, which I unpacked in my longer analysis. It goes into all the laws and all the regulations and all the policy documents. You know, people have often said we've got these great policies, but we don't implement them. Well, part of the problem why you don't implement them is that you're so focused on good governance that you never get out of your good governance echo chamber. So what am I saying? I think you know, what can be done? People do things in these communities themselves, okay, where they have agency. It sounds like many people in the Philippi example have very limited agency, but two examples that just come to mind. One outside, not far from me in Stellenbosch, where I live, where people invaded some private land. It was a good few years ago, and they had something like 200 new informal structures of shiny tin metal erected within a week. That's a rate of delivery that is very, very focused on need, and it shows a high level of delivery organization and strategizing by land invaders. And eventually the municipality bought the land from the private owner and put in services. So yeah, for me, that was an example of people outside the system forcing their way in to do the best that they could without romanticizing the living conditions that they have. And the other example relates to food. The Philippi Horticultural Association, who I've had a bit of contact with, comes to mind because food security is part of the human settlement story also, and the Kolobeni organic gardeners in the eastern part of the country who successfully resisted the ANC supported sort of attempt to do strip mining, to the point I heard this personally from somebody who gave a talk at the Philippi Horticultural Association a few years ago, to the extent where these people warned Gwede Mantashe and company not to come and visit and to with the mining company, I think it's an Australian one, as part of getting that process going, because they would be met with force of arms. And I'm not glorifying people taking to arms or violence, but that struck me as taking power and using a situation, and they back down, the Department of Mineral Affairs. So it seems to me there are examples where people take action and where they the circumstances maybe favor them in the way they don't in Philippi. Let me leave it at that.
Thank you, Paul. I won't repeat anything. Nomzamo, over to you.
Thanks so much for your and thanks to Gita and Yolanda. I think for me, it's that the question about how do we remain hopeful I think in the white paper, there's a reference to passive beneficiaries. And I think it's really important to hear these examples of people who've taken up responsibility over their own lives and are making a difference and are producing their own habitats. And I think it's also important as we sit here as practitioners to also try and find alliances across different expertise, across different fields, to make sure that we're able to support these attempts. That's what I can offer, unfortunately, to Gita. And I was quite grateful. I took some copious notes in both from both inputs about what is happening. And I think, for instance, I live in Johannesburg, and one of the challenges that we're dealing with at the moment is the fact that we are fearful of a response from the state, which will seek to kind of evict people en masse out of the Johannesburg inner city. And so to kind of listen to hear what people can do on their own while they convince our governments, while they're able to quote them on, you are already part of this global action plan on upgrading on informal settlements. Shouldn't you be treating us in this way? Shouldn't you be getting involved in this way? And using whatever tools we have available to us to make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Kashifa, the last word is yours.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I want to say to the comrade, you know what? I think we as different movements, we need to speak to each other also, because I know collaboration works very well when we speak to each other, you know, then we can say this is something that we need to filter out through other areas as well. Because, you know, when they see something is happening here, let's try and move it to other areas if it works properly in those areas. Because I think people are tired of waiting on government, not coming back, keeping people ransom. Because, you know, what we see within communities, the construction mafias is taking over big time within our communities. And communities are facing the brunt of this construction mafias. But the other thing that I want to say that, you know, when it comes to our communities, we want our government to be transparent. There should be accountability and resource. You know, when the resources are being sent back to national, there should be question asked. Communities should know these things before monies are sent back. Because, you know, when monies are sent back, communities are waiting, when are our things happening? And that is one of the things that we are struggling with, because that was in the IDP plan, but what is happening now? So it's like our communities are afterthought to these politicians. And then I also want to say, you know, these vacant buildings, why can't these vacant buildings be utilized for our communities? It's standing there vacant for many years. As soon as people occupy, all of a sudden there's something that needs to be done. And you can see some of the buildings are being run down deliberately so they can be sold off for a cheap amount of money for these developers to fix up and to make profit on that, because that is what we are seeing. I want to say also, comrade spoke about the food security. When there's upgrading in communities and houses being built, because, you know, our houses are so small when they build these RDP houses, even these structures that they put up, there's not even enough space to have a small garden, because in our communities, our people is going hungry. If there's enough space that you can utilize, you know, at least there will be something for you to eat. So that should also be considered. And the last thing I want to say also, it's the safety and the violence within our community. You know, even as movements, when we move around, we are also not safe moving around in some of the occupations, and not just the occupations, in the different housing areas that we are working with. Resource is also a huge trouble for us, because moving around in the community, it's not safe also, because you are faced with so many challenges. And, you know, when you see the city's officials is coming to the area, you will find that they're coming with a whole law enforcement. But we are the ones working there. You have to duck and dive when you work in these areas. So we are faced with all these challenges, but, you know, we're not giving up. we continue with the struggle because we know our community is very important to us. And we believe that, we need to fight these injustices with our community and we need to walk with them on this journey. And I think we need the lawyers like the series and the NUs who can help with us, that ground. We want the grounded lawyers who can help our communities, because some of our communities goes to court and in the side room discussions is happening also. So the resource is sometimes a really good, a big challenge for us as an organization also to do our work. But thanks for the opportunity, comrades.
Thank you so much, Kashifa. I wish I could adequately summarize all of the inputs from tonight, but I think some highlights are the critical role of community agency, recognizing that it does exist, and building ways in which we can collaborate across communities, across organizations, and as practitioners, and also just, really, really honing in on alternative and some of and engaging with cross-sector collaboration with these alternatives that we can bring forward. There was a big call for transparency and advocacy around how resources are spent, ways in which we can mitigate some austerity measures, avoid them, and for our governments to be answerable to the provision of housing and shelter, which is a fundamental human right. And just integrating some of these approaches, which are sustainable, equitable, and I think really, just to reiterate Nomzamo and Kashifa's points about remaining hopeful, because even as we are critical and we are analyzing and we are pointing out issues as we should, it's important for us not to lose sight of hope. So I think that's what I am personally taking away from this discussion, amongst many other things. But I think remaining hopeful and building solidarity, I think really is key in the work that we all do. So yeah, I think that's it for tonight. We are just 5 minutes shy of the 90 minutes I had asked for initially. And just to also say that I'm very, very thankful for everybody who joined this conversation as listeners, as contributors. We really are appreciative for this discussion. And just, as I conclude, to encourage everyone to continue engaging with this process, because as it's been mentioned, the lack of consultation that is often involved in these processes. So it's quite important to have our voice in shaping, future iterations of this white paper. So that's it for me. And thank you so much, everyone. And yeah, have a great evening. Stay warm.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you.